So I'm Tyler Kralicek. I'm going to talk a little bit about some fertilization, break down, okay, what are we doing with fertilizer, when do we apply it, those types of things. If my clicker works, if not, that's not a big deal. Okay, so why are we applying fertilizer? Well, obviously we want to make sure that we establish whatever growth we want in our flower beds, whether it be raised beds, your garden, your lawn, any of those types of areas. Okay? Depending on the type of fertilizer you utilize, you're obviously going to want to make sure you encourage root and shoot growth to make sure that you have a healthy plant. Okay? The other thing is, if you've got flowers or even vegetables for that matter, you want them to reproduce. So using the right kind of fertilizer at the right time will help you out and get that plant to the right stage you need it. And also, as always, to correct or prevent any kind of nutrient deficiencies. Now first what we're going to talk about is some nutrient deficiencies. That way, if you run into anything, you have a little bit better idea of what's going on. So deficiency is the absence that prevents the plant from developing normally. Typically you're looking at discolorations of a certain kind depending on which nutrient is actually deficient. It happens in grasses to broadleaves to about anything. Like I stated earlier, trying to fix the problem in terms of what your original parent material or original soil levels are is why you would usually fertilize. The first one,
I should have brought my leaf from my green beans. It's drying up. You think that's what that might be?
well, it could be multiple different things.
Okay,
but
well,
yeah,
go ahead.
it could just need water, although we've been getting really good water here
Well,
this
I
spring,
think
so
it's water.
it could be a potential nutrient deficiency. So the first one that seems to be pretty common in a lot of different areas is a nitrogen deficiency. As an example, you have an azalea here, and I don't know if you guys can see it super clear on these pictures, but typically when you're looking at a nitrogen deficiency, there is a uniform yellowing of the leaf. So typically it's almost going to look more sick. The older foliage is not going to look quite as healthy. It's going to go towards the end where it's pushing all those nutrients. So your tips are going to be a little bit darker in terms of their color. It's slowly going to keep on going through the whole plant. A lot of times it's going to stunt out your plant, and obviously your growth is going to dramatically decrease. With nitrogen, the main focus is that top leaf material or that top growth to really expand. Good morning. So, for example, with your lawns moving forward, if you want the top growth, and especially now moving forward through the summer, as soon as the temperatures heat up, we want to try and make sure that top growth is really kicking in. That's when you'd add that shot of nitrogen when that plant's a little bit more scarce on, whether it be the heat stressing it out or any of those factors. Okay? And typically, if you're going to add some nitrogen, just add in, even a 20-00 or a 20-10-10. Any of those types of fertilizers would help out solving this problem. The next one you're going to run into potentially is a potassium deficiency. As you can see, the yellowing margins are towards the center of the older leaves, or the stuff more at the bottom. You may experience some orange spots in different areas, and then necrotic margins or different areas in terms of how they're spreading might occur. You can see the yellowing happening between the ribs or between each vein. And the leaves could be frizzled, even though the midrib's alive. So to fix this, adding potash works really well. Or if you want to use a fertilizer, your P or your potassium is your second number. So if your second number is higher or you have zeros on both sides, that's the type of fertilizer you would utilize. Magnesium has been an issue in certain aspects, depending on where you're at, and again, that depends on what your soil is. Typically, you're going to have a yellow, more of an inverted V. You can see on these leaves, on this holly. Necrotic spots could happen. Also, the leaves will curl also. So adding some magnesium sulfate will solve your issue. Iron deficiency, and this, if you have trees, you could have like an iron chlorosis or any of those types of things. That's extremely common. Typically when you look at the leaves, the veins are going to appear extremely dark, and the rest of the leaves are going to look more of a yellowish. So that's how you can typically tell if there's iron deficiencies. So the young ones obviously turn yellow, the veins will remain green. Common in alkaline soils, and here in this Bismarck area or Burleigh County, we get all kinds of issues with iron chlorosis in certain areas. So when you're going to figure out what do I plant in this area, some can stand a little less iron in terms of the individual plant. So getting a soil test is going to be highly important to see where all these levels are. Okay? If you want to try and change it, using a chelated iron or iron sulfate, incorporating that into your soil could help out too. Any questions, everybody?
Well, we've got places in our lawn where the grass is brown. It's kind of just like different areas, and we don't know if it's a bug or if it actually is a deficiency in something. It almost,
Right.
because it's kind of angled, we wondered if it was actually a bug under there.
Mhm.
We did bring in an example, but they said I gotta have a bigger example than that to be able to tell. But it is turning green, so maybe the bug died.
Well, and see, part of the thing we ran into, and I know you were at my last talk, so what could be some issues that we ran into this last year?
Just talking about, I was just thinking about all the stuff you were saying too. Like you said, there could be some deficiencies, or it could be, maybe if it's not draining well, or what was it? Depending on the type of soil,
Yeah.
something like that, it depends on the area.
Yeah, and another thing we ran into this last year, we had a really bad problem with winter kill, just because our winter was so darn sporadic in terms of 50 one day and all of a sudden the next day it'd be 40 below, or it'd be 60 degrees and 20 below. So what it did, instead of having that snow staying that consistency, it melted off, formed an ice layer, and so essentially that caused that temperature to be a little bit cooler than typical. So that would have been one of the issues. I don't know if you use salt when you're doing your sidewalks or anything like that. I think wasn't your
Yeah.
area probably
Yeah,
what the
we
problem
did
was?
some of that too. We had salt because it was so much ice last year.
Mhm.
Well, we dug that up and planted some new grass.
Yeah, and that seems to be a pretty common deal. Wherever the salt
Right.
from, the snow or whichever, it got piled into your yard, that's where we had some kill spots. So just some couple things. Snow mold, very few issues with that, but I mean, that's still around. So just raking it up, reseeding, you should be good. Okay? Moving on, magnesium deficiencies. It's going to look a lot like your iron deficiencies. Only difference is you're going to have death at the bud. Again, very common in alkaline soils. So a lot of times what we're looking at is trying to make sure that you can incorporate something that'll help you out. So any kind of magnesium type product would actually increase, or decrease the amount of likelihood for this deficiency. Okay, zinc is highly important, not only just for us, but also for plants. Young leaves will just stay extremely small. Your air nodes are short, so in terms of our inner nodes, we're looking at the actual plant. In terms of where the growth is occurring, instead of having those be elongated and keep having that normal length, they're going to get a lot shorter. Okay, you're going to have wavy or puckered margins, and again, this is more in an alkaline type soil, which we do have some issues with that here in Burleigh County.
Well, I got a question for you. We have a lot of evergreens close to my garden, and it gets to be some of this evergreen. And will that cause the alkali? Will that cause an alkali to the soil, your evergreen needles?
Okay, there's been a lot of talk about that. Can it change the pH a little bit? It can, but is it going to be such a drastic situation where it's going to cause that soil to be alkaline or acidic or
Okay.
either way? Not typically. More than likely, that's a situation where your soil either originally was high or low in their pH, or, and as we're seeing especially after the flood, there's a lot of these saline seeps that are showing up
Yeah, well, of
because
course I
our
don't
water
think-
tables are so gosh darn high. And so that's where we're having issues with the saline problem or the
Well, ours
alkaline
is up,
problem.
where I'm uptown, I'm not really anywhere near the flood area.
Yeah.
I'm just concerned with all of the needles that are on it. And we do cover it in the fall to try to keep it from not having too many pine cones and needles in it.
Yep.
But okay.
And it's just good
It's no
practice to
problem? Okay.
take care of some of that stuff. And the other thing is sometimes those needles actually work really good in terms of organic matter, just releasing that back into the soil, giving some earthworms some
Don't stick your
food. So-
finger on one.
Okay.
Sorry, keep going.
So, in terms of soil pH, we're
See,
looking
now
at
this-
which levels
oh, this-
are we wanting, okay? So, typically, we're right at that 5.5 to 7 is about what we're looking at in terms of a healthy pH. Again, if you test your soil, send it off to a lab, see exactly where your levels are. They'll tell you what your pH Some people, in terms of decreasing your pH number, is using sulfur. That seems to work really good. So people have tried using like some other different products. That seems to work the most effective. If it's a little bit too low and you want to increase, adding lime will help you out. Okay, and I know, talking with Bob, you said you added some eggshells, did some other things. And there's actually some different ideas for a person here. In terms of some other things that have worked, I know some people said that they've used like a vinegar or even coffee grounds. Coffee grounds will change it a little bit, but it's kind of like the needles. It's not going to change it a whole lot, but it will give you a little bit of a difference. So in terms of suitable plants, that to me is going to be the best thing that you can do when you're setting up whatever you're wanting to establish. So you're extremely alkaline, you're going to make sure that you pick, say, a Russian olive. And if you can't get a Russian olive to grow in an alkaline spot, boy, you better hope kochia grows, because if not, I don't know what you're going to get to grow there, because those are the two hardiest things from that aspect. So versus, say, you've got a good pH, it's about 5.5, you can grow about anything. So fitting the plant to the environment instead of fitting the environment to the plant is kind of what we're trying to accomplish here. Okay, so in terms of fertilizer analysis, it expresses the weight when you're looking at the number. So 20, 10, 20. So we're looking at the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So in each pound, 20%, and I think that, next slide here, where I get ahead of myself. Okay, so for example, if you have a 100-pound bag of fertilizer, it has an analysis of 15, 5, and 15. How many pounds of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are in that bag? Does anybody know that one
Well,
already?
it would be 15% is the nitrogen, and 5% is phosphorus, and 15% is what? Every potassium? Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, it just correlates. So if you've got a
Yeah.
100-pound bag, if you've got a 50-pound bag, yeah, you just knock it in half instead of 15, 7.5. Okay, this becomes important when you're trying to figure out how to fertilize whichever area you want. So this publication, if you guys are wanting to fertilize trees, comes from NDSU, does a good job of explaining how to do that. And we will touch on that here in a little bit, but that uses an example of how to actually go through and figure that out. Okay, so in terms of the different types of fertilizers, we're going to talk about complete and incomplete fertilizers. Okay, your complete fertilizers are the ones that have all three of them tied in, like the ones we talked about earlier. 15, 5, 15, 10, 10, 10 is really common. Or if you're talking about incomplete, you're going to talk about how it doesn't have the primary three. So like a 2800 or a 2000. Okay, so like a 2000, what would we be using that application for? Does anybody
Just
know?
nitrogen, I would imagine, in my garden.
Yeah, just for nitrogen, so whether it be your garden. Another thing, in terms of timing with your lawns, a lot of people in the midsummer, and we're about 3 weeks behind this last year versus what we typically would be. So instead of the 4th of July, maybe wait until the 15th of July, you probably get away with it. But we're trying to stimulate that above ground growth versus, putting all that source into the leaf, or excuse me, into the roots. Now,
So
when
you
we
would
get
just
into the
use
fall,
the 20?
you just get away with just using the 20.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Now in the spring, typically you're looking Memorial Day, Labor Day are kind of the general rule of thumbs in terms of when you would fertilize with your lawns, for example. And then once in the middle, like I said, about July 15th, July 4th is the typical rule of thumb.
Okay.
But in the spring and fall, that's when that plant is trying to establish its root growth. Plus with the potassium, it's really good for plant health. Phosphorus, you're looking more in terms of the reproductive portions of your plant. Okay. All right, so the different types of fertilizers we have out there, because some people, you say pesticide, herbicide, and they about want to jump over the table and just smack you. Some people, well, that's fine, we can use that. So you have options, which is a nice thing. So if you want to go the organic route, obviously it's going to come from plants or animal material, contains carbon. Typically you're looking at something like a manure. If you get a sludge from like the county, urea, those are some different types of organic type of fertilizer. Advantages, obviously it's a slow release of nutrients because it's a little bit tougher to break down. The other thing is it's not as easily leached into the soil. and you add organic components into your media, or your growing media, okay? Cattle, for example, using their manure, when it's composted, it's broke down a lot further, but there's still gonna be a little bit more leaf material, left that needs to be broken down, and again, that's increasing that organic material back into your soil. Disadvantages can be hard to get. Luckily, we live in North Dakota. Hopefully you know some cattle producer or sheep producer or any of that. You can get some of those products. The one thing to keep in mind, I keep stressing about getting a soil test before you incorporate a garden or everything else, before you fertilize. It's the same process with your manures, composts, any of those things, seeing what level they're at, to make sure you aren't gonna actually enhance the issue that you already have. Say for example, it's high in its pH, the manure, and your soil is high in pH and you're wanting to address that, maybe try and get something else that's gonna lower that number to get you more at an ideal frame. In terms of sterility, it can have issues. Sometimes you get manure from feedlots, and depending on the hay that was used, depending on where it was harvested, for example, some weed seeds could end up blowing in there. All of a sudden you have some issues that way as well. Sometimes it could be low in nutrient content, and there again, that's where we get back to do your test, see what's actually in whatever you're incorporating into your soil. Okay, and sometimes it can be expensive. It all depends on what source you're getting, where you're going to for these different nutrients. Excuse me. So when we talk about inorganic, obviously we're talking about something that comes from a source outside of plants or animals. Typically, it's a chemical compound that's put together. A lot of your NPK type fertilizers that come in, like granules or in your bags, those are going to be your inorganic. In terms of advantages that you have, you can make the desired ratio of your different nutrients. We talked about a complete fertilizer that has your 10-10-10 or 20-10-10, any of those things. You can actually mix those up a lot easier with your inorganic. Typically it's easy to get. If you live next door to a Runnings, Tractor Supply, any of those kind of places that would have these types of things, Menards, Lowe's, I mean that's just off the top of your tongue. I mean there's other places that have these types of things also. Pretty easy to allocate. And sometimes it can be a lot lower in cost depending on what you're going to do. And the big reason why it's a little more efficient with your costs, it goes back to the point number one in terms of getting the desired ratio, because you can actually pinpoint, okay, I only need, say, 15% nitrogen and a 5% for the phos. So you can actually incorporate that into your blend. Disadvantages of inorganic: there's no organic material. Obviously, you're not going to add that into your soil. And possible chemical buildup if you do too much. Okay? And that gets into issues with nitrates, any of those types of things. So as long as you're applying them at a required or a desired rate, then you'll be okay. Alright, so another one is soluble. Obviously soluble means that it breaks down in water or dissolves in water, and it can be supplied to a liquid solution. For those of you who are fortunate enough to have a sprinkler system, whether it be set up in your garden or your lawns, this is the route you may want to end up going. So fertigation, which is essentially fertilizing through your irrigation systems, is the way that you would utilize this type of fertilizer. It's a huge advantage because most times it's pretty darn easy. You just have to have it lined into your system. Plus, in terms of adequate coverage, it's usually pretty efficient in terms of how it's spread. Okay? Insoluble fertilizers, obviously, they're going to include granules. They're going to be more of a slow release, and whenever they're applied to a media. So if you've got potted plants that you keep in your house, perfect thing to have. Then you don't have to re-fertilize with Miracle-Gro or whatever else you want to utilize. In addition, if you want to use these for peas, carrots, anything in your garden, again, that's less of an issue in terms of reapplying fertilizer. Okay, doing the comparison of granular versus slow release. Okay, the granular, pretty inexpensive. The biggest thing, it's easy to find. Biggest deal is just trying to figure out your way that you can actually spread it. Slow release is more expensive just because it's coated. However, you're more uniform in your release of nutrients over time. again, it's a lot less effort for you guys to put in when you guys use the slow release. Application procedures, we'll go through each of these, that way if there's a better situation for what you guys have in your garden, lawn, any of those things, you can go through that. So you've got, talk about banding, side dressing, top dressing, perforating, broadcasting, foliar spraying, and fertigation. So banding, essentially how this works, and a lot of farmers do this, or some farmers utilize this technique. And at this point, you know, we're a little bit past, so for next year, if you guys want to go this route, it'd be an option to do. So typically how it works is you've got your different seed rows, and in between those, about 2-3 inches deeper than where your soil is at, you're going to have your seed put in that middle. So essentially what you're doing is it's encouraging that root growth to go after those nutrients. So that's the whole process behind that. Now the reason why you don't put your fertilizer right in between or right next to that seed, you have a potential for burnout. So that's why we're going to put it in between where those different seed rows are. The next one is side dressing. So if you want to apply on top of the soil, this is an option for you. So essentially you've got your plants already coming through the ground, they're established really well, you still want to give them a shot of fertilizer. It's the same concept as banding, only difference is now we're just going to put that fertilizer along the side, so hopefully when those side roots or auxiliary roots come out, hopefully it'll seek out those different nutrients. Okay. Top dressing is another option that you have. Typically you'll rake in the fertilizer a lot of times. So what you're doing is you're having that fertilizer spread typically with a broadcast spreader, and within the first 1 or 2 inches it'll get in there or into your growing media after you rake it or whatever process you utilize. Okay. Broadcasting, that's just where you basically shoot it out of the whole darn thing. So essentially go out there with any kind of spreader, whether it be one of those hand ones, if you've got an actual garden tractor that you can use one of these, and it covers the whole entire production area that you're wanting to utilize. Okay. Another one that works pretty good is foliar spraying, where you essentially take those micronutrients and you apply them directly to the plant. How it works is the concentration shouldn't be too high. Oh, picture's gone. Anyway, so how it works is you typically will mix it in with your watering. So you'll have it above the plant. It'll quickly give you those nutrients that are deficient within the soil or within that plant that you're applying the fertilizer to. The problem is, like it says here, if you go at too high of a concentration, like especially nitrogen, it can burn that plant out. So that's why we want to be careful that we're not going at too high of a concentration. And typically with most of these things, if you're going to use certain types of fertilizer, they're going to have it listed on their label in terms of what levels are safe, which ones are going to be, you know, most ideal for what you're using it for. Fertigation, we talked about a little bit. For those of you who have automatic sprinklers, this is the route I would go, incorporating the water-soluble fertilizer into the irrigation system. These concentrated solutions are more easily go through, and they dilute and actually make it a lot easier on you guys to do your fertilization, because obviously it's going to go where the water goes. Foliar spraying, talked a little bit. Again, we're trying to get those nutrients above the ground or above the plant and try and introduce them. Just don't get them at too high of a rate. Switching over to trees, perforating is a really good method to make sure that your tree is in good health. Typically what you'll do with this is you'll make 4 holes or just in different spots around the outside where the canopy drip occurs. Is you're going to make your holes about anywhere from 18 to 24 inches deep, just to make sure that it's really deep so the roots hopefully aren't coming right at the surface, they're a little bit more down into the ground. And you're going to drop in the fertilizer requirement you need. Now with lawns and trees, typically a rule of thumb on nitrogen is going to be the same. So it's 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 foot. Okay? How do we figure that out on a tree? There's a couple different methods, and I know I talked about this publication earlier with fertilizing trees. On the very back it tells you about application calculations. the way that I like to do it the best, just because you're utilizing this drip line, is figure out whatever the radius is times pi to figure out this area. Okay? So for example, if the radius is 10 feet, okay? So we're going to take 10 feet times pi, which is 3.14, and we end up with what? Or excuse me, divide. No, yeah, you multiply.
You're talking about, you measure the trunk of the tree,
Yeah.
and then you multiply that by 10?
With the canopy drip line, you're going to go with the radius from the trunk all the way out. So how much area does this tree encompass? And if it's 10 feet, the radius, from the center of the tree out, okay, so to figure out this area, so 10 times 3.14 is,
31.
yeah, 31.4, okay? Now,
Okay,
with 1,000 square feet, we need to go, make sure I say the calculation correctly here. Okay, so we need to go through, or 314, or 31.4, divided by 1,000. And what do you end up with? Should be a percentage.
About 3%.
Yeah, so 3% of whatever your fertilizer is going to be. So if we go with, say, a 20, 10, 10, so 20% of a pound is only going to give you 0.2. So we need 5 pounds to get a full pound of nitrogen, right? It's a lot of, and it's not that hard once you break it down. Like I said, when you have this publication, it walks you right through it extremely easy, so.
can I tell you another problem we have with our tree? Last year, we had this bug that got into the apples, and they made this little, when they came out, they left a brown line. Well, so we decided to treat it in the ground this year. So we spread a, well, I think what was the name of it? I think it was a, whatever. We spread it around the outside of the root. Our apple tree just had loads of blossoms, but they sort of dried up. And we figured we put on too much of that chemical. Well, now the tree is living and it looks good, but now I'm afraid of it dying. What should I do to prevent that stuff from, would fertilizer help it?
Okay, so in terms of when you add your fertilizer, typically you don't want to go any time past the 1st of July. Okay, if you're going to do your fertilization. So to keep your
Okay.
tree alive, trees are pretty tough for the most part. I mean,
Okay.
unless you've turned all the leaves brown and you actually can peel back on the bark, like especially the smaller branches. If you do the scratch test is what I call it, and you'll have the bark come off. If
Okay.
there's green or living tissue there, then your tree is still going to be alive.
Okay,
Now, technically, for example, if your root is dead, the tree has enough energy stored within it to where it could live for anywhere from 2 to 4 years. So it might be able to come out of it. So just make sure you follow the directions
well,
next time.
this said that it was safe for apple trees,
Okay.
and so we didn't think it was, but I think that must be what we put on too much or something.
Okay. Well, and you know, it's one of those things. If you do have problems, bring it in and we can figure out what the
Yeah.
issue is. I mean, anthracnose especially, and you know, ash and other trees is just going to start coming around. You know, I talked about earlier how our season, especially this winter, has been really kind of goofy just from the standpoint of we've had a lot of moisture, but in addition to that, it's been kind of cool and we haven't had a whole lot of, you know, sun days here so far. So any of those types of funguses that require those types of conditions
Sure.
are going to start going
Well, what we
nuts.
had was black ash, and they had to be treated because they were getting that black stuff on them.
Okay.
And so we bought the product, the same products, and we could use it on apples, and so we thought we would use it on it for the apple tree, and I don't know, one of
And
those
it-
things, you
And,
don't
and
know.
the thing is, it could be a different issue, because sometimes
It could
there's a
be.
difference between a fungal versus bacterial
Sure,
versus maybe
sure.
there's a certain kind of bug or anything like that that could be affecting your tree, so.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, whatever.
And, well, and see, that's one of those things, typically, you know, we're living in the Bismarck area, there's a ton of trees, everybody likes their trees, well, it's no different than you, if you're going to the buffet, and you go to the spot where there's only a little bit left, no, you're gonna go to the spot where there's a bunch of good stuff, that way you can pile on what you want, right?
All right.
And that's kind of the way these bugs and insects and
Yeah.
fungus, that's the way they respond to.
Well, there's a few apples coming on it, so we'll hope that but that's interesting. It's not gonna die even if it doesn't. Okay. We'll
The
keep looking.
biggest thing is just, like I said, making sure that if you do the scratch test in the end of the
Okay.
branches, just making sure that it's still alive, because if it's already at that dead point, then yeah,
I've been
unfortunately,
watering it to keep
we,
it going,
we
so
don't get to have the hospice care experience where we just kind of slowly watch it
I'll
go.
try that first. Good idea.
But yeah, anytime you have problems, I mean, if you bring it in, we can
Yeah.
look at it and try and prescribe something for it. So, and especially this year, I mean, you know, ash trees, we've had a lot of issues in terms of, you know, not shedding, or not having that bud emergence as, you know, extensive as it has been in the past. And I mean, there's a number of different factors. It could have been stress from the injury from, you know, before. I mean, there's all kinds of different issues that could affect it, so. Are there any other questions? That's kind of the main part of my presentation. Again, the biggest thing is in terms of the amount of fertilizer you apply when it comes to nitrogen, because that's usually your most expensive nutrient that you're going to apply. It's 1 pound per 1,000 feet between your lawns and your trees both. Now with your trees, just to follow up and do my, wrap that one up, typically you aren't going to do that every year. A lot of times you can do it 2 to 3 years on, you know, your deciduous trees. You can do it about every 4 on your conifers. Now, if you want to get to do it every single year, I mean, you totally can. That's fine, but
Before
it's
July.
all. Do it especially before July. The biggest
July,
reason
okay.
is we want to make sure that that tree hardens off.
That's right, okay.
Yeah, because if you're giving it nutrient, it's trying to encourage that exterior or that leaf growth versus trying to put it back into the actual health of the plant, into the roots. So, you know, especially in that September time, giving it nitrogen, I'd be a little scared to try and do that just because all of a sudden they'll kick it into, oh, okay, I want to, you know, leaf out versus I need to harden off and get ready for North Dakota's cold winter. So,
Okay, I want to clarify something with you. We were talking about the lawns, doing it 3 times a year, Memorial Day, you know, sometime around July 1st to 15th, depending, and Labor Day. And you use the high nitrogen in July, but what ingredient do you need or chemical do you need the other 2 higher?
Okay.
Or is it just a 10-10-10?
For nutrients, it all depends on your soil. That's what it comes
Okay.
down to. But yeah, if you're going to try and incorporate any kind of, you know, phosphorus or potassium, a lot of times you'll do it in the spring and the fall, mainly because that's when that plant, in the spring, obviously it's wanting that plant health. We want it to set it up for the year. So that's why we kick in the potassium.
Okay,
The phosphorus
that's-
is going to help
okay.
with that actual reproductive and that the root stimulation growth. And that's also why we do it in the fall, to make sure that it's really putting those nutrients down into the roots. That way, hopefully it's got enough stored in there to where it's hardy for the next year.
Okay, so the phosphorus is root growth?
Okay,
Do I
so,
have it right?
so typically with your nitrogen, that's more your green growth or
Yeah.
your above ground growth, okay? Focusing on stem, leaf development,
Put that in the spring.
okay? Phosphorus, I always think of reproductive. I'm a cattle guy,
Okay.
so anytime we get ready for, you know, turnout, you know, breeding time, you know, you give them a high phos type mineral. So I always think of that perspective. So in terms of making sure that the flowering perspective is going to occur, also it also adds to the or the root growth.
Okay.
So when you get to potassium, a lot of that's mainly the health of the actual plants.
Oh, okay.
So, and I know Bob's got a great story about adding potash when he was living in a different state, but, so,
Well, my
works,
cucumbers aren't
don't it?
growing.
it works.
My cucumbers aren't growing in my garden. What should I add fertilizer to them?
It needs,
Okay.
they need heat.
They need, well, I suppose that's the problem. It's just been too cool.
Yeah,
It's
and
been
there's,
too cool.
I know you look at a lot of different cucumber plants that are out there, anything that was really advanced, if, you know, say for example, you bought some at a Lowe's or Gurney's or someplace
Okay.
like that, and it was already bigger. I mean, yeah, it needs heat.
Oh, I planted mine from seeds, so.
So, and I know
But my
they're,
potatoes are like that.
yeah, potatoes look amazing right now. Potatoes,
Yeah.
onion sets, I
Okay.
mean, a lot of the plants and vegetables do look great. But
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. It's pretty cool for our garden right now, so, but.
Yep.
But I usually, before we plant our garden in the spring, and I've got about a 10 by 20 spot, we usually go buy a couple of bags of what would you say, ground soil from Menards and incorporate that into the, and even though we tried to clean off as much of the needles as we could,
Okay,
so, but I've always been concerned that they maybe would make it acidy,
okay. See, and that's one of those things, I mean, yeah, will it change it a little bit, you know,
but
it
not that
can,
much. Huh?
but, you know, you're not looking at 2% or 2
Okay.
points or anything
That's
that
good.
extensive, so, I mean, yeah, you wanna rake it up, and that's just a good sanitation practice also in terms of getting rid of those leaves, because spruce, or, are they spruce trees too, or are they pine?
No, there's just pine,
Okay,
there's
so,
just evergreens, if
But-
you wanna call it that.
okay, but most of your evergreens, there's a plethora of different diseases they can get, whether it be, you know, your spider mites, your needle cast diseases and things like that, and
Okay.
especially with those fungus issues, with rhizosphaera, stigmina, any of those, it'll stay within those needles,
Okay.
and eventually I call it skeletoning out the tree, because that's what it looks like, just a skeleton as it goes up and affects that tree. So raking those needles up is gonna help with that plant health or that tree health a lot more.
Well, maybe
down
that's
the
where
road.
my green beans, the leaves got wrong.
Well, I don't know if it transfers over into your green beans.
I sprayed
maybe.
them with fungus because I thought, well, maybe it's a fungus of some kind. Well.
Yeah, it could be different stuff, and it could
Okay.
be, yeah, like I said, it could be some different things.
Well, it's interesting. I enjoy my garden, so I'd like to keep it going.
Yeah, but
I want to ask about the residual nature of nitrogen, the potassium and phosphorus, they'll stick around unless your soil's real permeable. And the story I told you, it was silt, so it was very permeable, it stuck around anyway. But how long, if my nitrogen level is proper now, is it gonna be proper again next year?
okay, so in terms of before you added fertilizer, or you've already added fertilizer?
Let's just say that it's wherever it came from,
Okay.
normal or what?
Okay, so if you're very fortunate, which is highly unlikely, but if you're darn fortunate to where your nitrogen level in your soil is right where you want it, then I wouldn't mess with it too much. I mean, like I said, if you want to incorporate a little bit down the road to increase that above ground growth, absolutely you can do a little bit, but in terms of the residual, I wouldn't mess with it. If nature's already had it fixed, don't mess with it, so.
Well, I didn't